We have heard success stories that make us want to cheer and spread the word about all the amazing things that are going on in our schools. And we have heard stories that have broken our hearts as they revealed the deep inequities that we see from one community to the other, one school to another, and across certain student populations that are not being fairly served by the funding formula as it exists today. We believe that every single kid in this state deserves an equally excellent public education, and there are no exceptions to that rule. Shouldn't matter where you live. It shouldn't matter how much your parents pay in property taxes. It shouldn't matter what language you speak or if you have a disability. Every kid deserves an equal chance. And we think our legislature has a significant role to play in fixing a broken funding formula and restoring its commitment to public education in this state. We have heard this at every turn, and we have seen that there are certain patterns that have emerged in the testimony that people have delivered in their districts. The first thing we've seen is that the revenue limits that bind how much districts are allowed to spend are unfair, and they're creating have and have-not districts. That is underserving our communities and our kids. We've seen that the funding formula is broken, and it's not doing the things that it's supposed to be doing. It's making it so that certain kids in certain districts are particularly underserved, and it's not addressing the needs of kids in poverty, kids who speak English as a second language, and children with disabilities. We've seen that special education funding, which has been frozen flat for a full decade in this state, is woefully underfunded and needs to be restored immediately. We've also seen evidence that the teacher crisis in this state is real. Teachers are leaving the profession. Teachers are worried about changes to licensure. And teachers are dealing with the aftermath of Act 10 in ways that are still causing friction and tensions in their communities. We need to address the reality of these concerns. Finally, we've seen that the impacts of expanding the private school tuition voucher program is hitting urban and rural districts alike in ways that's having a significant negative fiscal impact on our kids in our schools. And people are demanding transparency, they're demanding fairness, and they're demanding a funding system that's adequate to meet the needs of the kids where they live. We are excited today to be joined by folks from all over the state who have driven here to represent their communities and to stand before the legislature and call for change. And I'd like to introduce the next set of speakers who will share some of their concerns. They will introduce themselves as they go. We'll start with Dr. Julie Underwood, who is a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on School Funding, and is here today to share with us some of her observations and concerns. Julie?
Thanks. Thank you, Heather, for doing a great job of summarizing what we've heard so far in the testimony across the state, starting in January. So we've had lots of hearings across the state. As Heather said, my name is Julie Underwood, and I'm a faculty member at UW-Madison, and I'm a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission for School Funding. I'm also a member of the Wisconsin Public Education Network. So Heather's done some summary of some of the things that we've heard. I'd just like to summarize that in a little bit different way. Our schools are in trouble, which means our children are in trouble, and our communities are in trouble. Our future is in trouble, and it hasn't just started. This is kind of a long-lasting thing, but we are at crisis points. In the 2011 state budget. In the state budget repair bill, schools were cut by $1.6 billion. And $1.6 billion we were cut. That was the historic cut. We've never seen that number of dollars cut or that percentage cut out of public schools in the state of Wisconsin ever. And that cut has not been restored. That cut continues to harm Wisconsin's children today. The small amounts that have been added to schools' budget over the last few years that's not made up the $1.6 billion cut that we took. Heather mentioned the revenue limits. The revenue limits were set at like 1993 levels, right? 1992-93 levels. And it's put a damper on, or ceiling on, what schools can spend per child across the state. And it held constant people where in a position where they were that many years ago. I don't know of any other industry, any other business, any other capacity that has held funding at 1992-93 levels. It's just not realistic. And those caps are doing harm to our children today, to our schools today, to our communities today. Thinking of old things, the school finance formula that we're talking about as part of this Blue Ribbon Commission was originally constructed in the 1970s. It's been added to, but it's not been overhauled since then for 40 years. If you think about it, the world has changed drastically over the last 40 years. This school finance formula doesn't serve us well. It's harming our children, it's harming our schools, it's harming our communities. One of the things that Heather talked about was, the complexity of this formula. And, in the state of Wisconsin, we kind of pride ourselves on open and transparent public policy. That's been a hallmark of the state of Wisconsin. And you can't have open and transparent or public policy if it's so complex that no one can understand it, or very few people can understand it. And this system is so convoluted, because it's just been added to, that it's hard to explain to people. People, even public policymakers, don't really understand how all of this works. It allows for systems that don't make sense as well, like actually having a property tax levy, a school levy. There it is, we have a school levy that actually is property tax relief, not funding for schools. That doesn't make sense. It's not good, transparent budgeting. We need truth in budgeting so we actually understand what's happening and can make good public policy. We also need a system that's equitable and fair. In this system right now, it is not equitable and fair. The revenue limits make it inequitable and unfair. The fact that we don't send money directly based on children's educational needs is inequitable and unfair. The fact that we fund special education for private schools, or the state funds special education for private schools at a 90% reimbursement and in private schools, and a 26% to our public schools. That doesn't make sense, and it's unfair. It's unfair to actually decrease the amount of money given to public schools while increasing the responsibility that public schools have. Unfair, doesn't make sense, and is actually doing harm to children. So we've heard from the public in all of these hearings. We've heard from financial experts. We've heard from Wisconsin school administrators. And the message is absolutely clear. We're falling short. We're falling short on responsibilities to our children, and we're at a point of doing harm. We need to fix this. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jill Underley. I'm superintendent at the Pecatonica School District. And as Dr. Julie Underwood had stated, that there are lots of different inequities that permeate our school districts, particularly between the urban and the rural. 2 points or 2 things about our school finance system that I want to make. One is that quality of life. It shouldn't matter which zip code you live in. But when you look at our public schools, when you look at the funding, you look at the facility differences between some of our rural schools and some of the schools in suburban areas. When you look at the teacher pay, when you look at teachers who start out in rural areas and then are recruited to move to the suburban or urban areas, they've already been trained, we've already invested in them, and then we lose them for higher salaries in other districts. And then you look at those extras, the school instructional coaches, the gifted and talented coordinators. You look at the technology differences, you look at the athletic facilities. And the underlying message in all this is that kids in certain zip codes don't deserve the best. And the second point I want to make is math. When you have 2/3 of districts in declining enrollment, those districts are cash starved. They're taxing and levying already to the max. And they're doing this to pay operational costs like transportation, utilities, salaries, but they have fewer kids to generate money to sustain their schools. In our school district, when our revenue limits were capped in 1993, we have passed an operating referendum every 4 to 5 years, just to keep up with salaries, to keep up with facilities. If we need to do any kind of major upgrade for security, we don't have air conditioning, for example. Last week, it was 90 plus degrees in our school buildings, and when you think about asthma, when you think about technology and all the wiring that we have now in our buildings, and you think about just the health, who learns, who teaches, who works well in those kinds of facilities. Nowadays, you wouldn't consider building a building without that. We wouldn't consider having a car without air conditioning, but yet we allow our kids to have those kinds of things. I think, or go without those kinds of things. I think we have this prevailing attitude that we can get by, and that we can just deal with it, and that we just don't deserve the best. But I think we need to change that mentality. The best schools or the best roads or the best internets, the best public schools are part of our infrastructure. They attract residents and families and jobs, and we need to invest in them now. So I would suggest that we look at resources, particularly to those declining enrollment school districts, that in order to sustain those losses per pupil, just so that they don't have to continue to make do with less. And then also look at those secondary cost ceilings. Right now, we penalize districts if they spend 90% of this average. Let's lift that up to 100%. Why should we be penalized just because we have fewer kids or because we live in rural areas? Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Joanne Youngke, and I'm Policy Director for Wisconsin Family Ties. My organization works with families of students whose path to the fair chance at an excellent public education is rockier than most. Wisconsin Family Ties works with children, families of children who have mental health or behavioral health needs. And this is at a time when anxiety and depression are on the rise among the young people of Wisconsin. And when school funding is in crisis, our students who are already vulnerable are set at even further crisis. On the one hand, money can't buy the kind of human relationships and connectedness that help our kids navigate their challenges at school. But on the other hand, when funding is squeezed and class sizes balloon and staff are stretched past their limit, the relationships suffer, and so do our kids. Class sizes have risen significantly since the cuts of 2011. Support staff ratios for those who work with our kids who have mental health related challenges are far below recommended minimums. Social workers, counselors, psychologists, and nurses. And the dollar amount for state special education funding, as Dr. Underwood mentioned, has been frozen for a full decade, currently at a shameful reimbursement rate that has fallen below 26%. 10 years of frozen funding is 10 years too many. Wisconsin needs to turn this around, and we need to do it now. As our public school students with disabilities and their districts suffer the consequences of this frozen funding, our state has lavished funding on special needs vouchers over the passionate objections of disability advocacy organizations across the state, and happening without public hearing, without public input. For the students with disabilities that private schools choose to educate on special needs vouchers, they get over $12,000 fully funded, even if the student costs less. And if it costs more, the state will pay 90% of that. This is, quite frankly, a slap in the face to our public school students and their districts and their teachers. We've got this backwards. What we need to freeze are the special needs vouchers. What we need to fund is our public schools, and to do that in a way that makes it possible for everyone to succeed, most urgently for the most vulnerable of our students. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Andrew Wadey, President of Madison Teachers Incorporated, the union that represents the employees of the Madison Metropolitan School District. I'm here in that role, as well as a parent and a community member, to speak to the need to fix the way we fund our schools. The dysfunctional funding system we have creates inequities across our state and puts financial strains on local school budgets and taxpayers. This is compounded by policies and budgets on the state level that have cut funding for schools and diverted substantial amounts of money to non-instrumentality charter schools and private vouchers. This impacts our public schools in many ways. Many of our school buildings are in need of repair or upgrades, such as improved ventilation, as we heard, air conditioning systems, accessibility, safety, and more. Reductions in staffing result in larger classes, and that impacts our ability to support all of our students so they can achieve their maximum potential. Staffing cuts also impact the ability of schools to work proactively with students and families to address the social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs of our students, and those affect the learning climate and safety of everyone in our schools. The fact that parents and staff are spending increasing amounts of money to purchase things that school budgets should be able to provide is a problem, and that districts across the state need to pass referenda, in some cases just to keep schools open. More difficult to quantify, but critically important, is the message that inadequate funding sends. Budgets are more than financial statements. They're a clear indicator of what those who create them value. Our state constitution calls for publicly funded schools, but our current system fails to fulfill this mandate. Instead of supporting our public school systems, we've seen legislation passed and policy created that destabilizes and demoralizes our educators. Education is not a business, and it should not be run like one. Education is a labor-intensive effort, and cuts to funding have a marked financial impact on every employee. How is the system sustainable if employees cannot even be assured that their incomes will keep up with the cost of living in the communities they live in? Our current system claims to create competition between districts to attract educators, but in reality it's created unfair conditions that negatively impact students and communities. Any attraction that educators feel is short-lived as more and more choose to leave the profession or move to other states. This creates outcomes with some districts winning, but more districts losing quality educators, resulting in a net loss for Wisconsin. Educators recognize the work that we have to do to improve outcomes for all of our students, and we need our lawmakers and policymakers to listen to our voices as we advocate for our state's future. Now is the time for our legislators to put all students first and fulfill their responsibility to the people of Wisconsin. No more cuts, no more privatization. Create a system that fairly funds our state's public schools and commit to fully funding a system of public education that will work for all students, families, and communities. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We gathered this morning because we wanted to send this message that we've been hearing in every single stop on this blue ribbon tour of the state to a wider audience, so that people could know that people are really concerned about these issues, that they matter to our kids, they matter to our communities, and the time to take action is now. But we also held this event because we want the members of the Blue Ribbon Commission to know that we're paying really close attention to what happens here today. We're paying really close attention to what happens next. We don't want to just see another dusty report that sits on a shelf and does nothing. We've seen that in past sessions. We've seen great reports come out of, for example, the Speaker's Task Force on Urban Education last year. What happens to those reports? How are they translated into policy? How will it move into a budget that will actually work for kids? We're here to say that this commission has been charged with making sure that it does. And we're here to make sure that they know that we know that, and that we call on them to deliver those results, and that our children deserve nothing less. The days when we can kick this can down the road are so far behind us that it's embarrassing to even have to stand before you today and say it. We need to make sure that every single kid has equal opportunity to succeed in this state. We need to make choices with the policy and the budgets that we deliver to our communities that it does. We appreciate that we have an opportunity to bring these concerns before our state legislature, to bring them before our communities, and to call for action, and we invite you to join us. Today's hearing runs from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. The public hearing portion starts at 1 o'clock, so if you're in the area and you can get here by then, come on down. Let the legislators know what you have to say. Let them know your school's story. Visit our website at wisconsonnetwork.org. Click on the Blue Ribbon HQ tab and find out how you can contact the commission by email if you can't attend in person today. But let your story be known. Let your school's story be known. And let people with decision-making power in this state know that we are united across our silos in the education world, across our communities as parents and as teachers and as school leaders, and in a bipartisan showing of support for public education across this state. There is seriously no time to lose. We must take action now, and we thank every single one of you who is standing with us, whether you're watching or here or in your own way where you live, in sending this message to people who can make a difference. Let's call on them to do it. Thank you.